heart conversations from the Gospel of John, and I'm reading excerpts from John chapter 11. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. "Lord," Martha said, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to Martha, "Your brother will rise again." She answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus then said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" Then when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Do you know that feeling of almost getting there? Almost reaching a long sought after goal? The prophets and especially the psalmist captured that emotion by speaking of God's hope for salvation as a present reality, an expression of faith that the future they're hoping for is now. Jesus speaks about the kingdom that is at hand, even though it is yet to come. Think about this. Think about your eagerness to meet a loved one. You're counting the days, the hours, and the day finally comes, and you go to pick them up from the airport or the train station, and you're waiting, and the flight landed, and you know they're here. They're gonna show up any minute, right? You're gonna finally get to wrap your arms around them, give them a hug, and embrace them. You could almost feel their smell. So I finally made it to Hawaii. Ooh, it's been a dream. 3 weeks ago, I hiked the Kalalau Trail in Kauai with a friend. It is known as one of the top 10 most beautiful trails in the US and one of the top 10 most dangerous trails in the US. And I have to admit, it was one of the hardest hikes I've ever done. But it was an amazing experience that I've yet to fully unpack. But one of the most memorable moments for my friend and I of that 10-hour-long hike was the moment right after we crossed that fifth and last valley and came out of the valley and emerged out of it and into that last ridge that separated us from our final destination. And the Kalalau beach was right there in front of our eyes. I mean, we could see it. It was so close. We could see the few people who already made it there. And we're tired. Like after over 9 strenuous hours of hiking in rain and mud and humidity and mosquitoes and heavy packs, we're wet, we're hungry, we're tired, we're ready to put down our bags and take off our shoes, and boil some water and get a hot meal. And it's right there. We can see it. We can even feel the sand between our toes. But not yet. We still had another 30 minutes to hike to get to it. That feeling of anticipation, of hope, that knowing that you will get there and you will soon, is sometimes what gets us through a lot of the hard things in life. And I think that's what Mary and Martha's source of hope when they sent after Jesus and invited him to come and see their brother who is so ill. This almost not yet stops being bittersweet and hopeful when it's a matter of life and death. What was taking Jesus so long anyway? Isn't he so close? John tells us he was only 2 miles away from where Lazarus was. He's done dealing with Nicodemus and the woman at the well. He's finished healing the blind man. He should be on his way, right? He's almost there, but not quite yet. But then Lazarus dies. Now here's the first thump in the narrative. If you were here, my brother would not have died. Jesus hears those words twice, separately from each of the sisters. And it's hard to tell if that's an expression of faith or an accusation. What was taking you so long, right? And yet John makes the point of repeating that twice, validating the pain of the sisters, but also indicating a truth in the life of believers and skeptics alike, and that is that God does not always respond in the ways that we hope for. God is not always as quick as we appreciate, right? Nonetheless, John will also suggest that Jesus was indeed taking his time because there was something he needed to teach to those weeping sisters about life and death. So we have the taste of resurrection on this last Sunday of Lent before Easter is here. We have this almost introduction into resurrection, a little bite. Now let's name the obvious. This is a post-resurrectional account written from the vantage point of having already experienced the resurrection of Jesus. And there are multiple pointers in the story itself, the most evident being the very fact of referring to the resurrection of Jesus, which is a foreign concept to the Hebrew world. Resurrection started with Jesus. The second obvious fact is that this isn't really a story about Lazarus, though Lazarus is a character in it, sometimes also only known as the brother of Mary and Martha, right? He's not even the main character. Now, I skipped a lot of details because this is a really long passage, and Chris only allowed me a few lines in the bulletin. But between the moment Jesus hears about Lazarus' sickness and the moment he is at the tomb, there are 35 verses of deliberations on life and death and the meaning of resurrection. Now, the obvious question is, what is this story then all about? Well, I'm glad you asked. There's a fascinating Netflix documentary series about psychedelics called How to Change Your Mind. Anybody has seen that? Okay, bear with me. It's based on a book by Michael Pollan, who tells stories of ill persons who get treated with psychedelics, and after those intense experiences, one thing that happens to most of those patients is that they stop fearing death. And from that point on, their lives improve. For some, they remain sick, but they just live differently that amount that they still have to live. And for others, the sickness actually disappears because their stress levels decrease and they're able to live in the moment rather than living in fear, constantly dreading the inevitable. Now, I'm not advocating for psychedelic use, let me make that clear. But it seems like there is something that those patients have experienced that changes the whole way they think about death. And it is in their freedom from the fear of death, right? There's no freedom from death. We're all going to die. So latest statistics said 100% of population is going to die. Right? But it's this freedom from the fear of death that will free us up to live. And how much more free would our world be if we allowed death to happen and believed that in every ending there is a beginning? Rather than being a nation in the world that's obsessed with longevity, how would society be different? How would the church be different? How would our personal and communal lives be different if we allow the seasons of life to just unfold? If we learn from this idea of bringing death so close to life that it doesn't threaten us anymore. And I'm not denying the pain of death and of loss, and neither is the gospel. Even Jesus owns that and that expression in what's known as the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. This is not some pie-in-the-sky Christian discipleship lesson. Contrarily, there's a lot of humanness in this story. There's vulnerability, intimacy, physical touch, loss, grief, and death. Perhaps Jesus weeps because he knows he cannot take away the reality of pain and loss, that he cannot shield his beloved friends from that pain, that he cannot take death away, and yet he knows it so closely and intimately. And friends, I think it's very heartbreaking and comforting at the same time to know how familiar, how intimately familiar God is with our pain. But God is not going to fix everything that is wrong in life, but it invites us, the community of faith, every day to make the choice to act on God's behalf. Notice in the story, both Jesus and Lazarus needed the community. The story begins with the pleas of Mary and Martha, and they're sending after Jesus. And then it evolves with the community in the middle, interacting and appealing for God's intervention. I do encourage you to go ahead and read the whole chapter. Jesus needed the community to remove the stone that covered the tomb, to allow for his miracle to unfold. And finally, the story doesn't even end with the resurrection of Lazarus, but he was only going to be free after his family and his community are going to untie him and let him go. And I love that the heroes of this story are the women who are in it. Symbolic for us today as we prepare to install the active women of this congregation who, like Mary and Martha, are engaged in God's everyday struggle for justice and to create a just world. For these two advocates of life and for us today, when we come together to share God's struggle for justice, and when we embrace our mortality, yet anchor ourselves in the promises of hope, friends, it no longer becomes a matter of life and death, but with God, it is life and life. Thanks be to God.